These are the nations locked in conflict as of November 2024. Are we teetering on the edge of a world war without even realizing it? From the tense skies over Taiwan to the fierce struggles engulfing the Middle East, Africa, and beyond, we're witnessing the forces reshaping our world. Global superpowers like the US, Russia, and China are deeply entangled in these flashpoints, with stakes higher than ever. These clashes go far beyond borders, threatening the stability, security, and very lives we hold dear. Let's dive into each. Let's start with one of the world's most intense conflicts, Israel and Palestine. In 2023, the violence hit a boiling point, with Gaza caught in relentless clashes. Israel says it's defending against Hamas, while Palestinians fight for freedom and an end to occupation. This isn't just a local struggle. Global powers are drawn in, with the US backing Israel and Iran supporting Palestinian groups. The stakes couldn't be higher, and the impact ripples far beyond the region. Next is Syria, where over a decade of brutal civil war continues. It began in 2011 with protests against President Assad, escalating into a multi-sided conflict involving rebel groups, Kurdish forces, ISIS, and the Syrian government. Russia supports Assad, the US backs Kurdish forces, and Turkey targets Kurdish fighters near its border. A ceasefire was declared in March 2020, but sporadic violence persists, with millions displaced and cities in ruins. Syria remains a volatile hotspot where global powers continue to clash. Next, we have Iraq, a country haunted by decades of conflict. The 2003 US invasion, launched over alleged weapons of mass destruction that were never found, toppled Saddam Hussein but unleashed chaos. Iraq has since faced sectarian violence, insurgencies, and the brutal rise of ISIS, which left scars across the nation. Though ISIS was largely defeated by 2017, sporadic attacks continue, and tensions are high. The Iraqi government struggles with internal divisions, Iran-backed militias, and the presence of US forces. Stability remains elusive in Iraq. Next is Lebanon, a nation grappling with deep political and economic crises. Decades of instability, civil war, and regional conflicts have left lasting scars. Hezbollah, backed by Iran, holds significant power, often clashing with Israeli forces, creating constant tension along the southern border. In November 2024, Israeli airstrikes targeted areas south of Beirut and in the Bekaa region, resulting in significant destruction and casualties. The 2020 Beirut explosion devastated the capital, worsening an already severe economic collapse. Political corruption, hyperinflation, and shortages in basic supplies have left much of the population struggling to survive. Lebanon stands at a breaking point, with no clear path to recovery. Next is Iran, a country under intense pressure, both internally and externally. Decades of sanctions, political isolation, and economic challenges have taken their toll. Iran's regional influence, especially through support for groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon and militias in Iraq, has put it in constant conflict with Israel and the West. In November 2024, tensions spiked again, as Israel launched targeted strikes on Iranian assets in Syria, escalating the shadow war between them. Meanwhile, domestic unrest simmers within Iran, with protests over economic hardships and government repression. Iran remains a volatile player in the Middle East, deeply entangled in regional conflicts and power struggles. Next is Yemen, a country torn apart by almost a decade of war. The conflict pits Houthi rebels, backed by Iran, against a Saudi-led coalition supporting Yemen's government. Devastating airstrikes and blockades have led to widespread famine and a healthcare collapse. In November 2024, Saudi air raids intensified, worsening the humanitarian crisis. Yemen remains a tragic battleground for regional powers with no end in sight. Next is Afghanistan, a nation still struggling with conflict after decades of war. Since the US withdrawal in 2021, the Taliban took control, but violence persists. In November 2024, a bombing near a Kabul military checkpoint killed several, highlighting the ongoing threat from groups like ISIS-K. Afghanistan remains caught in a cycle of violence and uncertainty, with millions facing poverty and limited services. So, this is the current state of the Middle East. Interestingly, all the highlighted countries seem to align with Shia majority regions. Coincidence? We'll dive deeper into this topic in a future video. Now, let's shift our focus to Europe. Next, we have Ukraine, a country entrenched in a devastating war since Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022. The conflict has roots in long-standing tensions, including Russia's 2014 annexation of Crimea and backing of separatists in eastern Ukraine. In a dramatic turn, Ukraine launched its own counter-offensive into Russian border areas in 2024, escalating the stakes. Cities are ravaged, millions are displaced, and battles rage on in the eastern regions. With support from the US and NATO allies, Ukraine's pushback has reshaped European security, marking a new era of confrontation between East and West. Next is Georgia, a nation scarred by conflict with Russia since 2008. That year, Russia invaded and recognized Georgia's breakaway regions, Abkhazia and South Ossetia, as independent, a move widely condemned. Today, Russian forces still occupy these areas, keeping tensions high. Georgia seeks closer ties with the West, but remains under the shadow of Russian influence. Turning to Armenia and Azerbaijan, these neighboring countries have faced repeated clashes over the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh. The conflict traces back to the collapse of the Soviet Union, when both nations claimed the territory. Major fighting erupted again in 2020, with Azerbaijan reclaiming parts of Nagorno-Karabakh. Despite a Russian-brokered ceasefire, skirmishes have continued, most recently flaring up in 2024. The area remains a volatile flashpoint, with both sides entrenched and the threat of renewed war looming over the region. Turning to Sudan, a nation in crisis after conflict erupted in April 2023 between the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, and the powerful paramilitary Rapid Support Forces, RSF. Rooted in a power struggle following the ousting of Omar al-Bashir, the fighting has displaced millions and deepened a humanitarian crisis. Egypt backs the SAF due to shared regional interests, while the RSF has received support from groups like Russia's Wagner and some ties with the UAE. Despite international peace efforts, violence persists, leaving Sudan in turmoil and marking it as one of Africa's bloodiest conflicts. Next, we have South Sudan, a nation plagued by conflict since its independence in 2011. Civil war erupted in 2013 between factions loyal to President Kiir and Vice President Machar, and despite a fragile peace agreement, violence still flares. In 2024, the conflict in neighboring Sudan began spilling over, with over 300,000 refugees fleeing into South Sudan and fears that Sudan's war may ignite further instability within its borders. Uganda continues to back Kiir's government while the African Union and IGD push for stability. South Sudan remains deeply fragile, with peace still elusive. Then we have Ethiopia, where deep-rooted conflicts have destabilized the country. The Tigray conflict erupted in 2020 between the Ethiopian government and Tigray People's Liberation Front, TPLF, leading to widespread devastation and a humanitarian crisis. Although a peace deal was reached in 2022, tensions remain high, with sporadic clashes continuing. Ethnic conflicts in other regions also add to the instability, and international actors like the African Union are actively working to support peace. Ethiopia's journey to stability is far from over. Next, we have Mali, a country plagued by conflict since 2012, when separatist and Islamist insurgencies took hold in the north. Despite French military intervention and ongoing support from international forces, extremist groups linked to Al-Qaeda and ISIS continue to operate, destabilizing large areas. In recent years, Mali has shifted away from Western support, leaning more on Russian partnerships, including the Wagner Group, for security. The situation remains volatile, with violence spilling over into neighboring countries and peace still out of reach. Then we have the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, a nation mired in decades of conflict, particularly in its eastern regions. In 2024, the M23 rebel group intensified its insurgency, seizing territories like Kalembe in October, exacerbating the humanitarian crisis. Despite efforts by the United Nations and African Union, violence persists, fueled by competition for valuable minerals like gold and cobalt. Neighboring countries, including Rwanda and Uganda, are often implicated in the conflict, further complicating peace efforts. The DRC remains a hotspot of instability with severe humanitarian impacts. Next, we have Chad and Niger, both grappling with ongoing violence and instability. Chad faces internal conflicts and spillover from neighboring Sudan, while Niger deals with insurgencies from ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates. In 2024, both countries saw increased instability following political upheavals and intensified militant activity. Regional and international forces are stretched thin, struggling to contain the violence and stabilize the Sahel region. Then we have Myanmar, a nation with a long history of military rule that returned to crisis after a coup in 2021 overthrew its elected government. The military, or Tatmadaw, seized control, sparking massive protests and a violent crackdown. Ethnic militias and pro-democracy forces, now unified under the National Unity Government, have been in conflict with the junta ever since. In 2024, fighting remains intense, with China offering diplomatic support to the junta, while the opposition receives limited backing from the West. The conflict has displaced thousands, deepening Myanmar's humanitarian crisis and prolonging its struggle for peace. Next, we have Taiwan, a self-governing island claimed by China since the end of the Chinese Civil War in 1949. Tensions have escalated, with China ramping up military exercises around Taiwan to assert its claim. In 2024, US support has intensified, providing arms and conducting joint drills, while regional allies like Japan and Australia watch closely. The Taiwan Strait remains a tense flashpoint, with the risk of conflict looming over the entire region. In summary, today's major conflicts can largely be traced back to a few primary sources. In Europe, tensions stem from the legacy of the Soviet Union and renewed Russian expansionism. In Africa, instability is fueled by groups like ISIS, its affiliates, and the ongoing war in Sudan, which destabilize fragile states. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, conflicts arise from territorial disputes involving Israel and the influence of ISIS and similar factions. Interestingly, a pattern emerges in the Middle East, where many conflict zones involve Shia majority regions, raising the question, are Shia communities being specifically targeted? What's going on? That's a situation I'll explore in an upcoming video. These conflicts have sparked massive waves of displacement, forcing millions to seek refuge elsewhere. Many have made their way to Europe, transforming its social and political landscape. The challenges and complexities brought by these diverse populations are significant topics that we'll explore further in future videos. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you never miss an update on the issues shaping our world.